It's a real pleasure to be here again, and really want to recognize the Wilson Center not only for hosting this event, but for the recognition in the U.S. and globally. Transdisciplinary work, I think, is at so much at the center of so many of the issues that we're grappling with. I couldn't refrain from doing a little bit of a plug. The World Resources Institute was also ranked as the leading, the number one environmental think tank in the world, and so we're delighted to be here. What I wanted to do today, just very briefly, is share three things, a little bit on the substance of this agenda called the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, how it differs from the Millennium Development Goals. I want to talk a little bit about the process in terms of how the United Nations, the international community, has gotten to where we are today and what lies ahead over the next 9 months. And then I want to talk briefly about 4 or 5 issues that we believe are pretty critical in terms of realizing what the aspirations underpinning these goals actually would be. So I'm going to assume a basic kind of understanding of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think perhaps the thing that is most gripping about the Sustainable Development Goals is their desire to be much more transformative in terms of what they mean for the planet. And so perhaps that is nowhere more fully captured than at the heart of the goals is a desire to eradicate extreme poverty in the next 15 years by 2030, to eradicate all forms of poverty everywhere. And this is a theme that has remained at the heart of all of the conversations around the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is kind of the inspiration of what I think many people feel can really mobilize a lot of public attention to what the potential might be, that we have it in our ability in the next 15 years to actually see a world that is truly free of poverty. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. This is typically poverty is seen as income poverty. We know it's much more complicated than that. There is a lot of complexity to how to actually achieve this. But as a central story for the Sustainable Development Goals, at the center, eradicating extreme poverty is one, perhaps the most exciting one. But we do know it will be complicated. This is a nice little piece from Development Initiatives. And it shows that whereas the last 15 years, the rapid reduction in income poverty was in no small part attributed through strong, robust economic growth in countries like China, India, and elsewhere, we know that poverty over the next 15 years is going to be a little bit more intractable. It's a little bit more difficult to actually, and what this little diagram does is it shows where poverty is located. And it situates it between countries that are considered politically fragile, countries that are seen as environmentally vulnerable, or both. And that little green circle on the left of 47 million people in extreme poverty are in countries that are neither politically fragile or environmentally vulnerable. So the point being that as we look at eradicating extreme poverty moving forward, we're working in much more difficult political and environmental contexts than may have been the case in the next 15 years. But at the heart of the SDGs is this concept of a more transformative change in development. The second point I want to make about how do the SDGs differ from the MDGs is that they're much more comprehensive in scope than what the MDGs were. So on the left, you have the 8 Millennium Development Goals, and they were largely not exclusively, but strongly and quite rightfully focused on social sector issues, a lot on health, a lot on education, eliminating hunger. What you have now, the proposal that has been put forward by the main intergovernmental body, the Open Working Group for the SDGs, has been 17 goals. And what you see is a much greater balance of goals that are focused on the economic dimensions of development, the environmental dimensions of development. You may recall it was MDG 7, which was around ensuring environmental sustainability, largely an afterthought, actually, when the Millennium Development Goals were crafted about 15, 16 years ago. Now, there are no shortage of goals that speak to different dimensions of sustainability, whether it is around natural resources, whether it is around climate change, whether it's around food, energy, water. That sustainability now has both a set of specific goals associated with it, as well as it's integrated into many other goals. And I'm going to come to that in a sec. But you see this pretty significant shift in the scope to one that focuses not only now on some of the social sectors, but also that focuses on the economic and the environmental dimensions in a much more serious way. The third point that I wanted, and this is a complicated graph, but what one of the other critiques of the Millennium Development Goals was that it reinforced a silo approach to development. So you had your goal on X, you had your goal on Y, and there was very little connection between the different goals. There was a much greater effort in the design of the Sustainable Development Goals to identify targets or pieces of these goals that spoke to each other. So what you see here in this fairly complicated mosaic are the 17 goals, and what you see in the colors is the goals that speak to, the targets that speak to whether they're environmental, economic, or social in nature. And so what this kind of little color kind of mosaic demonstrates is that you look at any of the goals, and I know it's hard to read, but if you take energy or water, you see that the targets under that goal actually speak to social dimensions of development, environmental dimensions of development, economic dimensions of development, much more explicitly than was the case in the Millennium Development Goals. So there's a much more concerted effort to develop a much more integrated approach to how these goals and targets actually play out. Doesn't mean there can't be quite a bit more improvement, but there was a strong effort to try to make that happen. And I'd say the fourth thing, so more transformative, more comprehensive, more integrated. And the fourth characteristic of the Sustainable Development Goals that I think is worth mentioning is that they're, and perhaps the thing that is most profound is this idea of universality. Whereas the Millennium Development Goals were largely about how the rich world can pay for things to improve the condition in the developing world, there has been a real seismic shift in moving towards an agenda that would speak to all countries. And so this is a little schematic that we came up with, where if you look at the left, the Millennium Development Goals were basically actions that the developing countries would take that would be paid for, supported by the developed world, largely through aid. From there, we are moving towards a recognition that we want an agenda that is universal, so that not only speaks to poverty or deprivation in the developing world, but poverty or deprivation around all countries. So that's that second box about this concept of leaving no one behind. But beyond that, it's also another concept that's been embedded into this called kind of policy coherence for development. And what this concept is trying to say is that it also matters what policies one country has that may support or undercut efforts of another country to tackle poverty. So, for example, it's not just aid that the rich world may give. If they have trade policy that in some way hinders the ability of agricultural development in certain countries, that is a problem. So that we need to look at an agenda that actually gets greater coherence in trade policy, in support for R&D, in migration policy, in financial system stability, all of these things that could have a spillover effect that could undercut development efforts in other countries. So that coherence in policies is a part of this agenda. And finally, it's also about collective action, recognizing that the world now is facing not just issues that pertain to specific countries. There are bigger problems, take climate change, was a collective action problem that there needs to be mobilized a global response. So when we talk about a universal agenda, which is what this agenda aspires to achieve, it is quite a rich mix of different things that have been included that actually make it very exciting if it can be realized. So those are just kind of transformative, comprehensive, integrated, universal, kind of 4 dimensions I would just mention around how the SDGs aspire to be different from the MDGs. I just want to say a couple of words about process. So if you thought that was complicated, this is just the simplified version of the process of how we've gotten to where we are. This is a little diagram from the UN Foundation. And as many of you know, the SDGs were born out of Rio Plus 20. There's been no shortage of intergovernmental committees, technical high-level committees, public conversations around this. Probably useful to point out just a few of the big pieces or ingredients or inputs into kind of where we are today. There is a high-level panel that was co-chaired by the heads of state of Liberia, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom that came out with a report, the high-level panel report in June of 2013. Actually, I think the report, came out in 2013. There was an open working group, a formal intergovernmental process that came out of Rio Plus 20, but that really came to life in 2014, where the 17 goals and the 169 targets came to life. There was a Secretary General synthesis report that came out just a few months ago in the fall that tried to bring all of these efforts together. There's been a lot of effort around public consultations. So you have this, anyone